Hello. This is the reading of Taming Your Mind, and we're up to Chapter 8. I'm your host, Tuna Jeans, and before we get started, this is a little unusual, but I just wanted to talk about a piece of direct mail that I received today. And actually, I'm going to see whether or not I don't think I can do this right, but I'll go ahead and put up the turret view, and you can actually see the direct mail piece. Isn't that sophisticated? The production values on this show have just increased so enormously. So I got this piece of direct mail from Spectrum, who's my cable company. And what's really funny is they seem to be trying to create the impression that there's something important inside. It's like colored brown, and there's a "do not bend" in red stamped on it, and a reference number, a really long reference number, and it says "important notice, action requested." So, of course, I'll open it. The option requested is to get a Spectrum mobile offer of some kind. What a surprise. And I kind of wonder, was there a corporate meeting where they decided to make this and make it look fake? Do they think that's okay? Anyway, I digress. So let's get to Taming Your Mind by Ken Keyes Jr. Actually, we're really reading from How to Develop Your Thinking Ability by Ken Keyes Jr., which is the original book. We're up to Chapter 8, which is Keeping Up to Date. Tool number 5, the When Index. And I'll do another really amazing production value transition here. So we did the what index, now we're doing the when index. And once again, he starts with a quote. "The world rolls. The circumstances vary every hour." Ralph Waldo Emerson. In our fast-moving world, it is important that we stay on our toes to avoid being surprised by changed conditions. A doctor was awakened in the middle of the night by a phone call from a man for whom he had done some medical work a few years before. "Doctor," said the excited man, "please come over right away. My wife is in great pain, and I'm sure it's her appendix." "Well now," replied the doctor, "I don't think that's it. I'll drop around the first thing in the morning. Don't worry, it's probably just indigestion." "But doctor, you've got to come right now. I'm positive it's appendicitis," protested the alarmed husband. "Oh, come, Mr. Johnson," the doctor said somewhat irritably. "I took out your wife's appendix almost 2 years ago. You know as well as I do that that couldn't be it." "That's true enough," said the husband, "but I've got a different wife." The doctor assumed Mr. Johnson's wife of 2 years ago was the same person as Mr. Johnson's wife on the night of the call. In this case, of course, his assumption was a normal one that anyone might make. But when we come to important matters on which we risk our health, financial security, and happiness, we cannot afford mistakes. If we want to live as worthwhile a life as possible, we must try to achieve a .980 average in batting out adequate maps. This will be impossible if we have not developed a deep down feeling of the way words do not change, but the things represented by our words are constantly changing. Some things change slowly, some very rapidly. Some things within a year's time will change in important ways. Others, during this time, will undergo only minute changes that are insignificant for our purposes. But whether changes are fast or slow, large or small, so far as I know, we live in a world where all things are processes. So far as I know is in boldface because it's one of the earlier chapters, in fact, the first chapter in Tool for Thinking. Let me just take a sip. I guess I could transition to me for these little breaks. Tasty beverage. To continue, think of the various ways we human beings change as the years saunter by. We start out as a fertilized ovum with all our needs supplied. At birth, we are ruthlessly evicted without even any clothes or teeth. We try to make the best of this bad situation, and slowly and with much confusion, we gradually learn to walk, to talk, and not to pull the tails of big dogs too hard. We keep growing taller and wider, get through various schools, and eventually get started making money or making babies, or both. We stop growing taller, but more often than not, keep growing wider. Wrinkles and double chins appear, and the hair that does not fall out frequently turns gray. The gallant husband will stoutly maintain that his wife is just as beautiful as the day he married her, but he will admit that it takes her longer. From the time we are 1 minute old to the time we die, the things we like to do and the skills with which we do them constantly change. The foods we enjoy, the sensations we like, and the state of our blood pressure will shift from time to time. What can be one man's meat in 1 year may be his poison the next. Not only ourselves, but the things around us are constantly shifting. The stock market, the weather, the grass on the front lawn, and the rattles of the family car keep changing from time to time. The North Star. You have probably heard the phrase, as constant as the North Star. But a close look shows nothing but change. The North Star actually goes around in a circle from our point of view and is due north only twice a day. And as if this inconstancy were not enough, the star we call the North Star changes over a period of years. When the Egyptians built the Great Pyramids, Alpha Draconis was the North Star. Today, it is Polaris. 12,000 years from now, Vega in the constellation Lyra will be the North Star. Shakespeare assumed too much when he wrote, "But I am constant as the northern star, of whose true, fixed, and resting quality there is no fellow in the firmament." I'm going to take a little break to take a sip. This might be drawing it out too much, but I'm going to do the transition. Pretty good, huh? And now go back to the tools for thinking and continue with things that change. There are 2 platinum iridium meter bars maintained by the Bureau of Standards in Washington. And speaking of things changing, it's no longer the Bureau of Standards, it's now the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. Getting back to the text, the Bureau of Standards in Washington, to act as master patterns, these 2 platinum iridium bars, for our yardsticks. Every possible effort is made to prevent changes from taking place in these meter bars. They are kept in a vault and used only about once every 5 years. But even these meter bars are not changeless. All things are made up of atoms whose tiny electrons move over 100,000 miles each second. That is a distance of over 4 times around the Earth. What appears to our fingers and eyes as something solid is, on the atomic level, a mad dance of particles constantly knocking each other billions of times per second in a chaos of confusion and unpredictability. On the atomic level, nothing is the same from one split second to another split second. There is nothing but motion, change, dynamism. Frequently, the atoms on the outside of an object will leave the object and escape into the air or into adjacent matter. For example, when a block of lead is put on top of a block of gold, some of the gold atoms will jump in the lead, and some of the lead atoms will be found knocking about in the gold. And so, even our meter bars, with all precautions taken to prevent change, will manage to slip a few changes over on us. The loss of a few atoms each year does not keep them from being useful to the Bureau of Standards, but it does qualify them as a rather phlegmatic brother of all other things in the world that constantly change. Our maps can become obsolete. That's a section heading. On his first trip to the Florida Keys before the war, a New York lawyer spent a delightful day fishing with an old native sponge fisherman named Edwards. Noticing how the old-timer's skin had been browned and wrinkled by the tropical sun, the lawyer said, "Edwards, would you mind telling me how old you are?" Not a bit, he said. I'm 68. Recently, this lawyer was again visiting southern Florida, and he decided to see if Edwards was still around to take him fishing. He found Edwards sitting on a pier, mending some mullet nets. The Florida sun and wind had put a few more wrinkles in Edwards' face, but otherwise the lawyer noticed very little change. After they had been trolling for some time among the islands, he asked the old man how old he was now. I'm 68, was the prompt reply. But you said you were 68 when I was here 7 years ago, cross-examined the lawyer. How do you explain that? Explain it? There ain't nothing to explain. Do you think I'm the kind of feller who would be telling you one thing one day and something else the next? That's pretty good. This is not in the text. And it actually brings up an interesting point that Christian Science doesn't think you should keep track of your age or birthday in order to not let yourself, this doesn't capture it exactly, but in order to not grow old. You basically should not remind yourself of changes like that in the world. So, just an aside, we're back to taming your mind. Unfortunately, it is often necessary to tell people one thing one day and something else the next. We change and the world changes. This complicates our attempts to maintain a stock of adequate verbal maps. Just as a portrait photographer has trouble taking a picture of a child who will not keep still, so we have trouble keeping track of a world that will not stand still. Alfred North Whitehead said, "Knowledge keeps no better than fish." The 1946 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica has an article that says, "Its, uranium's, chief use at the present time is in the ceramic industry." The atomic bomb has made this verbal map as dead as a dodo. Even if we did know all about something today, changes in the terrain may make our verbal maps obsolete tomorrow. We cannot survey the territory once and for all. We must keep our eyes open and our minds open in order to recognize important changes. The facts of yesterday may be the fictions of today. There's a section heading, Living People with Dead Knowledge. Old age, said Montaigne, plants more wrinkles in the mind than in the face. A young mind strives continuously to mature its verbal maps. An old mind tries to defend its verbal maps from any change whatsoever. Whether you have a young or an old mind cannot be told by looking at your birth certificate. Some people in their 80s have younger minds than many people in their teens. This old age ought not to creep on a human mind, said Emerson. In nature, every moment is new. The past is always swallowed and forgotten. The coming only is sacred. People wish to be settled. Only as far as they are unsettled is there any hope for them. The 6 tools for thinking help us stay young in spirit, regardless of the number of candles that belong on your birthday cake. Can I do a smooth transition? And I know this stuff seems quite simple and basic, but it actually is hard to make it your habit. I can attest to that myself, and I think if you think about it, you'll see that it's true. And the important thing is to try to change your habits so that you acquire good habits when you really need them, when you have to make a decision. Okay, back to the text. The when index, or date. You know you live in a changing world, but how are you going to act as if you know it? The tool for thinking that will enable you to reflect this principle in your everyday life is the when index, or the date. Webster defines an index as an indicator or pointer. The when index simply points out when the territory was surveyed. For the next few months, while you are getting familiar with the application of this tool, deliberately add the date to whatever you talk about. The U.S. government today, your mother, 1970, television, 1950, around the time this book was written, your car, next year, your business, now. Whether a given statement is true or false will often depend upon the date. Many futile arguments take place when people omit the when index. Mr. A. Beaver Lodge is a wonderful place. The food is fine. The fishing is good. I don't know why you don't like it. Mr. B. Why, I swear, I don't see how you can stand that place. If that's what you call good food, I'll bet some hog swills are better. And the fishing, I could see them, but they wouldn't bite for anything. The argument went back and forth, the tempers up and up, and the nasty remarks lower and lower, without reaching any agreement. Too bad these two didn't realize that Mr. A was talking about Beaver Lodge now, and Mr. B was talking about Beaver Lodge 1970. Then they might have realized that both of their maps were adequate, provided they were time-stamped. Since we live in a changing world, we must always be willing to resurvey the territory in order to make our maps reflect the way things are now, and not just the way they were last year. Let the historians treasure the out-of-date knowledge. It's their business. It's our business to have in stock the most up-to-date maps that will always give us predictability in our thinking. Since we're coming up on a section heading, I'll take a break. I've heard that's at least one, and perhaps some people like when I take a break because they can too. So I pass that along as a tip to you. And you can enjoy a tasty beverage. Unfortunately, there's no advertisers for me to push. And maybe you wouldn't like them anyway. So let's transition back to the tools for thinking. And the section heading is "The Tools Can Be Misused" at the top of page 122. Like any tool, the technique of dating can be mishandled. We must not go to the opposite extreme and assume that everything has changed in ways important to us and that the verbal maps of last year are of no use today. We cannot say, well, rattlesnakes used to bite people, but I understand that absolutely everything is guaranteed to change. I'll just pick up this one. It is as stupid to assume that things have changed as it is to assume that things have not changed. A fool would be no better off with these tools for thinking than he would be without them. Using them requires discrimination and the application of your intelligence. The individual's own good or bad judgment is the guide, said John Dewey. There is no label on any given idea or principle that says automatically, use me in this situation, as the magic cakes of Alice in Wonderland were inscribed, eat me. The thinker has to decide, to choose, and there is always a risk, so that the prudent thinker selects warily, subject, that is, to confirmation or frustration by later events. And that's from How We Think by John Dewey. You must test the tools for thinking in your everyday life to find out what they will do for you. You must try them out as you would try out a new gadget. Like all tools, they have limitations. They cannot be used blindly. It takes practice and perseverance to learn what these principles will do for you in your own thinking. Advice, when presented in a book, sounds like old stuff, and of course it is. Education, said Ruskin, does not mean teaching people what they do not know. It means teaching them to behave as they do not behave. The next section on the top of 124 is A Great Man and a Great Problem. Albert Einstein was with Mahatma Gandhi, one of the world's greatest pacifists. Einstein felt that World War I was mainly fought for certain economic reasons, and it did not make much sense to him for a lot of people to get killed just to help a few people get richer. According to this view, such wars are fought under the guise of protecting the national honor. However, when we scratch under the surface, we will find rivalry for colonial possessions and the desire of some foreign businessmen to have their foreign investments protected, even if it means that many of their countrymen must die in war. For many years, Einstein taught young people to refuse to serve in any war and to oppose all armaments, even for defense. When one country arms for defense, surrounding countries do likewise. The defense programs snowball larger and larger until everyone is ready for war. As late as the spring of 1931, Einstein maintained this view. At that time, a group of American clergymen announced they would take no part in future wars, even if their government claimed that it was for the defense of the United States. Einstein wrote regarding this manifesto of the clergymen, "It is a gratifying revelation of the temper of the American clergy that 54% of those who answered the question should have indicated their purpose not to participate in any future war. Only such a radical position can be of help to the world, since the government of each nation is bound to present every war as a war of defense." However, once having taken his stand in favor of the principle of pacifism, Einstein did not become blind to the facts of this changing world. The things he observed in Germany gradually convinced him that his verbal maps, while adequate for World War I, were not appropriate for the coming World War II. He saw about him a group of fanatics under Hitler who were singing Deutschland über alles, and who were rapidly developing insane methods of thinking, Wir denken mit unserem Blut, which translates to, "We think with our blood." The Nazis showed no respect for freedom of speech, individual liberty, or any other human rights. They were willing to use any amount of terror or force to make the Nazis rulers of the world. Einstein felt that his pacifist maps no longer fitted the changing conditions. Now, a narrow or consistent man would have stuck by his principles. A consistent man wouldn't be caught changing his mind. He would say, if something is true, it's true, and he would explain away the facts before his eyes. A consistent man would foolishly feel, if I change my mind, that will be like admitting I've been wrong all these years. But Einstein, like all mature people, was more interested in having adequate verbal maps than in maintaining a foolish consistency. In the latter part of 1931, a group of Belgian pacifist youths, realizing that Germany was preparing for war, turned to Einstein for advice. The principles they had adopted made them oppose all armaments and military training, but they did not want their country to be defenseless when Germany struck. They were in a dilemma and wanted Einstein's opinion because they had confidence in his integrity and intelligence. He had been living in Germany, and he would have had a good opportunity to survey the territory. I'm going to take a break and I turn the page here. And continuing on the top of page 127, skipping a few diagrams for those of you who are trying to keep track of page numbers, by the way. I'll describe them at the end, I think. When Einstein replied to them, he renounced the pacifist principles that he had spent years of his life building up and defending. When the situation changed, he was willing to change his verbal maps. He was not so blinded by his principles that he couldn't keep them useful. As a scientist, his ideal is straight thinking, not straight-laced thinking. Not sure what that means, but anyway, when Einstein, I see, not binding by being straight-laced. When Einstein came to the United States in 1932, some women's clubs tried to prevent his immigration on the grounds that he was a pacifist, but their maps no longer represented the territory. Einstein, January 1931, acted in ways that are called pacifist, but Einstein, January 1932, had changed, and it is a part of history that Einstein, August 2nd, 1939, addressed a letter to President Roosevelt which began, "Some recent work by E. Fermi and L. Szilard, which has been communicated to me in manuscript, leads me to expect that the element uranium may be turned into a new and important source of energy in the immediate future. A single bomb of this type, exploded in a port, might very well destroy the whole port, together with the surrounding territory." And that was reprinted by permission. I could talk more about that, and if I can remember to, I will at the end. The next section is a foolish consistency, and we're still on page 127. How can we hope to be consistent and never change our minds about things when, 1, our knowledge is not complete, and 2, the rapidly changing conditions of this modern world from time to time make obsolete even the best maps? A foolish consistency, said Emerson, is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. With consistency, a great soul has simply nothing to do. He may as well concern himself with his shadow on the wall. Speak what you think now in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradict everything you said today. Ah, so you shall be sure to be misunderstood. Is it so bad then to be misunderstood? Pythagoras was misunderstood, and Socrates, and Jesus, and Luther, and Copernicus, and Galileo, and Newton, and every pure and wise spirit that ever took flesh. To be great is to be misunderstood. That is the way Emerson felt toward people who latch on to some eternal principle and hold to it no matter what. Walt Whitman expressed himself rather clearly. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. This business of separating the wisdom of the past from the out-of-date ideas, prejudices, humbugs, and bunk that accumulate is beyond a doubt one of the toughest and yet one of the most important things we must do. No one of us is ever going to be entirely right in sorting the sheep from the goats, but the better we do this job of keeping our knowledge up to date, the more successful and the happier we will be. I kind of inserted a word there, but I think it didn't affect the meaning. That's on page 129 for those of you following. I'm going to take a drink before we sum up, which is the next chapter. I hope you're following along with the text and the beverage. To sum up, when we date our verbal maps, we remind ourselves that our heads are crammed full of what Robert Hutchins called rapidly aging facts. Many a man fails to become a thinker, declared Nietzsche, for the sole reason that his memory is too good. Dating our maps will help us keep our old knowledge from blocking new learning. I'm going to repeat that. Dating our maps will help us keep our old knowledge from blocking new learning. In a way, I think that's the summary of the entire chapter if you understand the phrase dating our maps. Since reality is constantly washing its face, we must remember occasionally to scrub up our verbal maps too. The date on a map reminds us that this is the way the territory was when it was surveyed. Whether the map is still adequate at a later date cannot be told by examining the map. We can tell only by checking the territory of today. As the world rolls, we must recheck our verbal maps. As the circumstances vary, so our maps must vary if they are to be useful guides, if they are to have predictability. It is silly to embalm our verbal maps in a changing and jet-propelled world. It is just plain stupid to be true to our ideas when they are no longer true to us. And that's the end of chapter 8 on page 130. And I'm going to go back and look at the drawings and describe them. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to talk about some things that I noticed or remember that I thought were interesting about that letter that Einstein sent to Roosevelt that got the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb started. And it is interesting, I think. Einstein was living, or at least vacationing, somewhere out on Long Island, at his or somebody's summer house. I think actually like fishing in a little rowboat. And two people, Leo Szilard and Edward Teller, who were both also physicists and specifically atomic physicists. I couldn't tell you whether or not they were Nobel Prize winners, but they were certainly of that caliber. They drove out to Long Island with this letter to ask him to sign it. It's usually thought that Einstein wrote the letter. I believe it's fairly well documented that Leo Szilard actually wrote it and Einstein read it and agreed with it to encourage Roosevelt to start the Manhattan Project. And the only reason the two of them went out there together was because Leo Szilard did not drive. So essentially, Edward Teller took his place in history as a great proponent of atomic bombs and later hydrogen bombs, possibly the physicist who had the least bad feelings about what they had done in creating the atomic bomb, or certainly the most supportive that it had to be further developed all the time was Edward Teller. Leo Szilard, when they were successful, but Germany had already been defeated, was strongly against the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan and really tried about all he really could to prevent it. What else was interesting about that? I think there was something else. Oh, and there's a really great movie called Insignificance that's kind of about Einstein and his pacifism, but his supporting of the atomic bomb and his feelings afterwards. And it also includes him meeting Marilyn Monroe and her husband. I can't remember who it was, but she married a baseball player briefly. And it actually has this scene where Marilyn Monroe is explaining relativity to Einstein. It's quite good, so I recommend it highly. So now that we've gotten those things out of the way, I think there were a few other parts, but maybe I'll see them as I'm describing the various drawings in here by Ted Key. And I guess I can also show you the drawings. I'm a little bit worried about that from a copyright standpoint, but I think it would be okay. So let's switch to a camera. Oh, I was in a camera. And I would switch to the turret camera, but it's shrunk. And I could probably fix that, but I'm a little bit worried about trying to fix it while I'm in a live stream. So I'll just use this. And here's All Things Change on page 113. Oh boy, this isn't going to do well at all, is it? For those of you who are willing to freeze frame at that point or still, go for it. What we'd call a homeless man is leaning on the door of the phone booth. And by the way, another example of how all things change is, what does a phone booth mean to a young person today? Do they even know the concept? And a well-dressed businessman is talking, and underneath it says, "I'm bringing a surprise home, dear. Remember Lamar, that great, big, handsome He-Man you're always talking about? The one that you could have married instead of me?" So I can kind of understand that one. I must say, having read this book carefully now, I can really see how it's terribly sexist. And if anybody would like to do a rewrite of it, or a new edition, or a book based on it, obviously I do not have any permission to create a derivative work, but I don't think the ideas behind general semantics are protected in any way, since this book is taking them all from Science and Sanity. Anyway, on to the next drawing. So ahead of him is a landslide, very much like the landslides we've had on 33 lately, and a huge boulder a huge billboard that says "Road Out Landslide," and the guy in the car is saying to the passenger, presumably their husband and wife, or maybe not, but anyway, they can't see what's ahead of them because of the road is turning around the mountain. And he's saying, relax, I know this road perfectly. I've been driving it all my life. And you can see they're headed at pretty high speed to that turn. Huh? Get it? And I'm not really sure that I get this one. You can see the young woman in the bikini walking past the two older women, one holding an umbrella, and it says, the next thing they'll be doing. So maybe there's nothing to get. Maybe it's just that the older people can't accept the newer fashion. But I have a feeling I'm missing something about that. And it says, the modes of yesterday may be the laughs of today. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that they're wearing very old-fashioned swimsuits. And by the way, did you know that the bikini got its name from the atomic bomb tests that were carried out at Bikini Atoll? This chapter in this whole book is having much more of a atomic bomb theme than I would have expected. Okay, the next drawing is on page 120. The date makes a difference. And I guess it's the guy is explaining to his son, and that must be his wife, and he's telling the story. Then I picked her up and whisked her away. This was a good 20 years ago, of course. It's pretty easy to get the joke there. Sorry about the joke. This is opposite page 122. Though we live in a changing world, we must not blindly assume that everything will change in ways important to us. We don't need to insulate the house, says he. We'll never have another winter like the last one. So actually that's a kind of non-sexist, from the wife's point of view, drawing. I think it might be the first one, maybe not. And it sure is relevant to what's going on now with climate change, and I feel like this is the coldest winter in Southern California I've ever experienced. This is opposite page 127. and there's two guys fighting, and it says at the top, the tools for thinking can prevent fights, and at the bottom it says, Doris, you have callers. That's the mother shouting up the stairs, presumably. Maybe these drawings could all be redone. This is opposite 129. Things Change is the heading, and it says, remember that cute little puppy you tried to buy from the Stewarts? They gave him to you today. And of course there's a dog that's very dirty and the room has paw prints all over it. And that's the last drawing. And let's see, what do I need to say at the end of this that I've been trying to mention in all of these chapters? I guess the first thing is that I'm reading Taming Your Mind, which was originally published under the title How to Develop Your Thinking Ability. The original copyright was 1950 by Kenneth Keyes Jr. and Roberta Keyes, and it's copyright 1975 by the Living Love Center. And I've made some attempt to get in touch with them if they're still around. I haven't had any success. And this book, Taming Your Mind, which is available readily as of today, March 9th, 2023, on Amazon used for a fairly nominal price, like I think around $5 with maybe $4 shipping, something like that. And it's trying to take the ideas of general semantics, which are explained in a much larger book called Science and Sanity by Alfred Korzybski, which is not very available, unfortunately, but a version of it called Selections from Science and Sanity is available on Amazon, new for like $11, and I think free shipping if you have Prime. And I think you could find Science and Sanity in PDF form online, but it really is a difficult read. Although I liked it. This is Roman numeral 20 page. I'm just trying to show you the tables. It's like abbreviations that he uses in the text, and you do have to get used to them. It's like a dot, comma means etc. So often there'll be a sentence which is a list, and that tends to happen if you use general semantics. And that's why he came up with these abbreviations. And they really do make sense, but it takes a while to learn them and notice that you saw one of them and say etc. And sometimes a sentence won't really make sense until you realize that. Let's see, what else? And Science and Sanity is from 1933 and will often have things in it that reference 1933 versions of science. But surprisingly enough, most of 1933, the science is still valid. They basically knew that everything is in a constant state of flux and that matter and energy are the same thing, and that matter is a convenient form of energy in some ways. And like most matter is actually empty space. Things on that line. The scientists knew that now, and they're things that, although most people have heard of atoms, they don't really have much more of an idea of how small they are and what's actually going on, in my opinion. Not to be too uppity about it, as if I know what's really going on, but that's really the goal of general semantics, is to be able to say what is going on in a changing world, how to use words to do that. I guess that's about it for this session. If you've gotten this far, thank you for listening. By all means, subscribe to Tuna Genes, and if you're interested enough in participating in a live stream, then do click the notification bell to know when I'm doing a live stream, since I don't really have any mechanism to let people know or schedule them or anything like that. So that's all, folks. Oh, wait a second. One more thing. I'm going to put up the link to the text. This is the full text of Science and Sanity at the European Society for General Semantics. Each chapter is a PDF file. So if you want to go through a lot of work, you can download the whole book as individual chapters, or just pick a chapter that you're interested in. I don't know the chapter number, but I would recommend On Abstracting as a good chapter, or just chapter 1, of course. I do think Korzybski, although he's dealing with a difficult topic because you're talking about how words affect perception, and he has to use words to tell you, I think he does a fairly good job, and you might find it interesting. So, and here's the actual link to the text. And with that, I'll say good night, goodbye, and see ya.